Hi, Joe. Welcome, everybody. This is the fifth conversational interview with Professor Joe Phoenix, one of the co-conveners of the Gender Critical Research Network. My name's Hannah Marston. I'm a research fellow in the Health and Wellbeing Strategic Research area at the Open University, and also an affiliated member of the network. My background's video games, older adults, women in games, and general technology use within society. So, Joe, we're going to have a great conversation today, and we're going to start with the first question. What does gender critical mean to you?
Hannah, I'm glad you asked that question, and I'm going to say it in that kind of like, I'm glad you asked that question because we've been asking it to everyone, so it's, you know, a fairly standard question. I wanted to be able to answer this question in a rather oblique sort of way, not directly. And I know this is going to sound terribly academic because it's going to be almost like, you know, how many angels sit on a pinhead sort of answer. But I think for me, the term gender critical actually has a history, a very long history, and it's not necessarily the history that people would think. So the term can be used politically to denote a social movement, and that social movement has been one that sits, if you like, in opposition to or contradistinction to gender identity. For me, gender critical doesn't mean that. It's actually an emerging theoretical perspective, and it's emerging out of, if you like, some fairly dramatic social changes of the last, 2-3 decades, as well as political changes, as well as technological changes. So I just want to back the whole conversation up and go back to some of the basic terms of reference and some of the history around it. So if we think about when we first started distinguishing between sex and gender. Now, Laura, in one of the videos earlier, podcasts earlier, talked about how John Mooney started coining gender to denote social roles. Well, that was in the kind of 50s and 60s. By the time we get to the 60s and 70s, and we see the kind of introduction of academic feminism in particular, we see sex and gender being distinguished, sex being, that biological makeup, gender being social roles, and thus it went, if you like, for a while. And you see the rise of academic feminism in particular, that was looking at how ideologies of gender, so norms around, normative frameworks, I should say, around what women do and what men do and how that maps onto particular types of bodies, was seen as, if you like, the kind of the real thing about what academic feminism was all about. But it didn't just have the concept of gender. It had the concept of gender as it was grafted onto, used by, deployed within the concept of patriarchy. So that we were able to use that notion of gender, whether it was a discourse, a social role, a set of ideas, as a way to talk about women's exclusion from particular types of things. Like going back to the 1960s and 70s and 80s, there was a lot of discussion about women being excluded from the public domain, the world of work, the world of politics, and so on. Now, as we go from the 80s to the 90s, within social sciences, we see a rise of they called it alternatively the discursive turn, the narrative turn. Now, for me, the importance about the rise of that wasn't that we start seeing academics being interested in discourse or narrative, but we see social scientists being less interested in social structure. So that kind of dips off. And so then the concept of gender a la Butler, a la queer theory, takes a new altogether turn. Instead of talking about social roles and ideologies that graft onto those social roles that make the social look normal and natural, instead of talking about that, we start talking about gender as a performance, how we perform being female or being male. And then very rapidly off the heels of that, we start thinking about gender as an identity, the thing that I am, who I feel I am, the inner me that needs expression. So when I hear the term gender critical, one of the things that I'm thinking is, yes, we sit within an entirely different world than the world of the 70s and 80s. Women's place within the social world, particularly in most Anglophone countries, has dramatically shifted. There are very few people that would argue that women's realm is in the home, and only in the home, and that women should be the primary caregivers, or that, you know, male sexual violence particularly is normal, natural, and understood, and we just have to put up with it. Very few people would argue that. You know, I don't know how far back your history goes, Hannah, but those were arguments that were regularly made in the 70s and 80s. So there's been a dramatic social change around that. But then also there's been dramatic social changes around sexualities as well. So that when I came out in 1979, I mean, I'm going to digress and tell a little personal story here. The country I grew up in, Texas, in the 1970s, as children, we used to play a game called Smear the Queer. Smear the Queer was when whoever had the football, you just kicked the shit out of, pardon my language, you just literally, it was a pile on, right? Now, it was only when I came out later that I thought, oh my God, that was one of the most homophobic games that you could possibly imagine. And of course, nowadays, you know, it's much more possible for people like me to come out and be lesbian and gay. So we've got social changes there around sexualities, and those are normative changes, how we value or don't how people live their lives, and what consequences that then brings. But I want to talk about another set of changes that are really important for us to think about, and those are the medical drug regime changes that enable us to change our bodies. Now, we could talk specifically about trans, but I'm not going to. I'm going to sit here at the age of 57 and tell you, as I think you know anyway, I've had 2 knee replacements, 2 shoulder replacements, and my spine fused. Medical technology allows us to encounter our bodies in a fundamentally different way than 50 years ago. 50 years ago, even 30 years ago, I don't know that I would have been able to have shoulder replacements. They're relatively new, much less ceramic shoulders, right? So technologies have fundamentally changed as well. Now, for me, we've got to a place socially, politically, ideologically, in which these terms, sex, gender identity, sexualities, have come to take on a multiplicity of meanings. Gender critical, for me, enters into that space of these multiplicity of meanings in a way to say, okay, we're going to be critical of gender, but we're not going to lose that originating term, sex, right? There are things I was rereading Of Woman Born, Adrienne Rich, 1976. And one of the things that Adrienne Rich said is that there can be no feminism without thinking about women and reproduction, because, you know, women encounter their bodies. And that's you know, I'm not going to say assigned at birth. I'm going to say female. People who are female encounter their bodies in a way that are fundamentally different than people who are male. And, you know, some of that, we just can't get away from that. I mean, not just the immutability of sex and all of that sort of argument. We can't get away from our biological constraints. Now, I know that as a disabled woman. I know that as much as I want to get away from the fact that I have a body that fails, I can't. So for me, gender critical is a way of recapturing some of that space around biology and encountering what it means to be embodied in today's society, which is very different from when we first encountered those terms, sex and gender, and tried to disarticulate them. That was a really long answer, but bottom line is, it is an emerging theoretical perspective and a way to talk about some of the profound social changes that we've experienced in the last 30, 40, 50 years.
And before we move on to the second question, I just want to ask you in regards to what gender critical means to you from maybe the standpoint of politics and rights claims.
Yeah, okay. One of the really interesting things that I think has happened recently is that there has been a conflation. By that, what I mean is a fusing together of political and rights claims along with academic perspectives. And it's not necessarily very helpful, to be perfectly frank with you. How we see the world necessarily shapes the sort of politics that we have. And the politics that we have might be ones that push us towards rights claims, but we could have different sorts of politics, right? Now, one of the things I've been criticized for, and people think that I'm transphobic for doing, is criticizing Stonewall. Right? I will happily criticize Stonewall, happily. And this is the organization that I used to really feel very connected to, if you like, back in the day. But one of my concerns is that it has abandoned any sort of radical cause for trying to instill a particular version of rights in employment places. Well, that's just one tiny part of the world, and if we go back to the 1960s, even in civil rights claims, we know the difference between Malcolm X, who was, more radical and revolutionary in his vision, if you like, of what an emancipated or liberated society might look like vis-a-vis race and ethnicity, from Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was absolutely down the line for employment rights and civil rights, hence the term civil rights. So the thing about political and rights claims and gender criticality is that I think there's a common misconception out there that being gender critical is making some sort of rights claims about sex and gender identity. Now, in some places it is, and that's the particularly with several of our members, that's the heart of their work, is trying to balance those competing rights. But I just really encourage everyone to realize that, if gender criticality is an emerging theoretical perspective, to look at these new dynamics within society, and to do so without losing a sense of the importance of the body, then that doesn't necessarily translate to being anti-trans or anti-trans rights at all, even though that's what's generally claimed. So I think that's what I'd say.
Thank you. So the next question that I want to ask you, Jo, excuse me, why did we call the Open University Gender Critical Research Network that term?
Sorry, I don't mean to cough, but I'm just coughing. Well, I'm really glad you asked that question as well, because, going through a lot of the social media feeds and things like that, people have said, oh, it's just a dog whistle for transphobia. That's absolutely not the case. It's the Open University Gender Critical Research Network because it's part of the job that we all do. Research networks are standard fare within academia. It's how people who have a common interest get together and talk about that common interest and either promote research or just exchange ideas or, just feed each other, if you like, with ideas and different perspectives. So that's fairly normal, the Open University, whatever, research network. Now, gender critical, we've called it gender critical because everybody who's part of this network is either coming from or sympathetic to or wanting to explore what that sexed-bodied perspective means. So to call it the Open University Gender Critical Research Network is not a dog whistle for transphobia because, quite frankly, I'm not entirely sure that I'd be comfortable with people joining the network who were anti-trans, explicitly. And there are people out there who use the term gender critical to spout some of the most vile stuff about trans individuals. Do you know what I mean? And that's not what this network is about, despite what people say. That's not what this network is about. Yeah. Now, the other thing probably to mention here is why gender critical. And we're going back to the first question, because there is an argument that says that that term can only ever mean critical of gender identity. No, and that's all I'm going to say. No, that is a misconception. It is a myth. If you look through the various legal rulings about this, but also, because I don't really want to go down the route of law and legal rulings, but if you look at how people use that term, there are increasing number of academics using the term gender critical to capture both critique, which is what we're supposed to be doing, but also that sense of not losing the materiality, for lack of better words, of our sexed bodies. So, you know, I think the only thing I'd say is it's not a dog whistle. This is an emerging theoretical perspective, you know, and we have new theoretical perspectives within social science. They call them paradigm shifts, and they emerge on a very regular basis.
I just want to come in here. So for the network, from my perspective, is, you know, it's positive, you know, it's bringing already people together, and, you know, we'll be doing more so in the future, but also the interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary of the existing members already out on the webpage. And, you know, maybe for those that are going to be listening to this podcast, you know, do you want to explain a little bit about your background, your academic background? And for me, you know, my background originally is computer science, and I came into interdisciplinary during grad school when I started looking at older adults and gaming, and that's the field of gerontology. There's also other subfields that I'm a part of, which is gerontechnology, and through research that I've conducted and published, you know, it's bringing these disciplines together. And as you say, looking at the materiality, the embodiment of the sex body, relating to technology and gaming. Yeah,
which is, I mean, you know, I love that part of it. You know, there used to be, back in the 90s and 2000s, there used to be this kind of common sense perspective. And I don't know if you were ever exposed to it. And this common sense perspective ran like this: that the entire world was sex differentiated, right? You know, and there was a sexual differentiation or sexual division of labor, you know, men's jobs, women's jobs, except for the world of tech, right? And computing. And then, you know, and of course, I was always critical of that idea, because it was like, well, how come this world of tech and gaming and computing, gaming particularly, could be so sexually differentiated when the rest of the world was, and also when you look at the content of some of the games. So for me, when you started talking about some of your research and the technology, of course, the lights were just going ping, 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 ping. Because, you know, if we go back to like that first question that you asked, we live in a technological world at the moment. And I think a lot of our social science, particularly around issues of sex, gender, sexuality, gender identity, we don't think that much of both the role of technology, but also how some of this stuff is expressed through the technological world. For, you know, and I'm using really bad terms there, because, you know, you're the person who knows about that. And I'm just thinking, yeah, the fact that we're talking on Teams, you know, this is different.
I mean, yeah, and, you know, from a gaming and tech standpoint, you know, we'll be talking about that in the future. And, you know, that will be another fascinating podcast. I also want to come in, you know, what you mentioned about gender roles within employment. Just before I started my master's, I did a summer vacation at a very famous sweet factory. And, you know, I was in the packing department, and, you know, putting sweets into boxes as they came off the conveyor belts and things like that. And just the uniforms that we had to wear. We had to wear a smock, and very different to the other departments where the sweets were made, which in the packing was predominantly women apart from those who, like myself, the male students who, you know, they've been packing as well, but they would be wearing trousers and a t-shirt.
Yeah.
The other departments where the sweets were being made, primarily male. I only ever saw one female in that department, and they were wearing trousers and t-shirt.
Well, you know, Hannah, the thing that makes me feel sad and very old, right, I'm going to say it, because this is now, you know, nearly 2.5 decades I've been doing, I mean, formally being paid to be an academic. And of course, you know, I was 10 years before that. So the first time I walked into a sociology classroom was in the autumn of 1982. That's how far back I go. And we never had a problem, ever had a problem discussing the absolute obvious way in which societies were sexually stratified, right? And by that, what I mean is that there was differentiation made on the basis of biological sex, and that there were social roles and whole sorts of everything, if you like, that were grafted onto that. You know, to your sweet story, I would add the fact that in the summer of 1986, I know it's going back some, I was working for Sue Shepherd Employment Agency, right, as just some kind of office person in the upstairs, making notes of the interviews that the real people had downstairs with potential people that they would place in you know, kind of companies and things. These were on index cards, right, because it was before the age of technology. And the things that I would take the index card notes and write up something on the typewriter. Well, it was a word processor, I think they called it back then. And some of the notes that I would type up were tall, blonde, well presented, right? And you sit there and think, oh my God, people were actually doing, well, nowadays I sit there and think, can you imagine what would happen if people recorded things like that after interviews? You know, so I think some of what I'd like to recapture, and, you know, particularly around the interdisciplinary stuff, some of what I'd like to recapture is how do we begin to talk again about those sexual divisions of labor, about sexual differentiation? How do we recapture some of that? And for me now, 2.5 decades later, I know that as a sociologist, I'm technically a sociologist, even though I call myself a criminologist. I just have like an oppositional sense of identity. But yeah, I know I can only answer a part of that. I can put questions into a broader social setting, but I might need psychologists. I might need people like you who have got expertise in, you know, understanding gerontology, because I mean, my goodness, there's an embodied discipline, isn't there? You know, you know, I might need a whole range of people to help, and I know that people from other disciplines also help feed the ideas of people like me. So, yeah, I think it's really, really important that we.
I think as well, you know, from my perspective, with gaming and tech, you know, certainly from gaming, you know, literature over, you know, the last 20 years plus, you see the differences in the writing. You know, there are gaming differences between male and female gamers. Their experiences are different depending on the type of game they're playing, whether it's an online multiplayer game or a console. And also, you know, time, depending again on the genre that you're playing, whether it's a casual pick 'em up, you're on a bus commuting or a train, you can have, you know, you can have 10 minutes on a casual game. You can't have 10 minutes on a first person shooter or a multiplayer role-playing game.
Yeah, I mean, it's really fascinating, isn't it? I remember back in the day, I can't remember exactly when this is, but I remember when gaming first kind of started, all of the discussions about Grand Theft Auto.
Yeah.
That was the name, Grand Theft Auto. And of course, you know, that was the realm in which young boys, from a feminist perspective, that was the realm in which young boys, i.e. males, were first introduced to sexual violence. And they were learned, oh my goodness, they were taught through games like that, how to objectify female bodies. Now, I mean, I don't know. I've never been part of you know, I think there are problems with that set of theories simply because it infers that we're a little more than, you know, kind of tabula rasa that get imprinted, you know, depending on what we engage with. But nevertheless, I remember shortly after those discussions, another whole thread of discussions about girls, and it was always girls, not women, who got into gaming. And of course, when my own grandchildren got into gaming, I was like, oh God, are they going to get into that world of Grand Theft Auto? Or is there other sorts of games? You know, and so yeah, I think it's amazing that we've got you. I'm really hoping that we can start actually having conversations about technology within the group once we get past the summer and start actually getting down to, you know, some grassroots and grounded activities, that we can start thinking about projects or research agendas that may cross all of these different substantive research interests. Because of course, my substantive research interests are in the realm of justice, criminal justice, and you know, I have spent a lifetime doing stuff on sexual violence of one form or another, predominantly around prostitution and child sexual exploitation, you know, and how we create justice, for lack of better words, for victims of those sorts of crimes. But also I've looked at, you know, around youth justice. And again, bodies count there, although they're young bodies, and you know, or they're male and they're female bodies. But, you know, some of the stuff that I've done around youth justice dovetails even with the gender critical research network, because what we're talking about is how practitioners, namely youth justice workers, youth offending team workers, make sense of the sort of body that they've got in front of them with the history that body comes with, you know? So, you know, is it a 17-year-old big burly lad who's been convicted of, you know, I don't know, some sort of public order offense, or is it a 13-year-old girl who's been convicted of a public order offense being the fact that she was out in a park very late at night, and when the police officer stopped her, she swore at him, you know? So that how practitioners make sense of those sorts of bodies and ages becomes critical to the sort of things that I'd have spent a lifetime working on.
And before we wrap up, I have one excuse me, final question. What exactly is a research network? I know we've been touching on it. And what did it take to set it up?
Okay, a research network. I mean, it's worth saying this because, of course, people over the course of the summer, since we've set up, there are quite a few people who have thought that we're a political group. We're not. A research network is a loose affiliation, a conglomeration, an association of people who, as part of their paid employment, get together to talk about research. Research not being activism per se, although some researchers are activists. Research is predominantly about exploring questions and answers to those questions. And research networks are some of the places where you go to refine the questions that you want to ask of the world and to actually figure out if there are new and different ways of understanding your own questions that you have of the world. So these are research networks. They can become repositories, if you like, for ideas, so that people just kind of like exchange ideas, create reading lists. They can become seminar-based, and I really hope that we're able as a network to do some seminars where people present their ideas and, you know, they can be exchanged and discussed and debated. They can be generators of research grants, you know, where people come together and actually think about Do we want to apply for some money to be able to explore this particular set of questions? They can be about, sharing publications before you send them off, right, for peer review. And that's a really important part of what we do, because of course, you don't want the first set of eyes to look at your publication being the peer reviewers who may, knock it down. It's much better to actually explore with your colleagues before you send something off. And because we come from a variety of disciplines, and indeed with this network, a variety of universities, and indeed, one of the things I'm really excited about, it's not just a variety of disciplines, a variety of universities, but we're also talking quite fundamentally different academic traditions. So we've got some Americans, we've got, some Australians, we've got people who are philosophers, along with people who are not social scientists, with social scientists. So I think that kind of mix of people, we can come with the same set of questions, but understand them so fundamentally differently and be able to exchange that sort of idea. Now, the thing I have to say, absolutely have to say, and you'll, I'm sure, agree with me on this, research networks they're just meat and potatoes to the academic world. And of course, I've said this continuously in Twitter and places, we're not doing this because we're hobbyists. This is part of our paid employment, to gather together, to talk about ideas and to do research. So the network's just there to really facilitate that.
And I think as well, before we finish, as you say, it's our meat and potatoes, and being interdisciplinary, be it as a researcher or as a group of people, which this network is, I think over the last few years or even longer, having that space to bring people together and to share ideas and debates from very different disciplines can organically bring new items to the table.
Well, particularly, Hannah, because gender criticality is an emerging theoretical perspective, right? So, there's a real difference between extant theoretical perspectives, say like Marxism, that's there, it's got 100-year-long history, it's gone through all sorts of trends and changes and fashions and fads and encounters, if you like, whereas gender criticality is very much of the now. It's emerging. So we need, in a sense, all hands to the decks, and we need the best minds to come together, and we need people that can bring something both challenging and new. Because of course, just because we're in the same research network doesn't mean we agree with each other. Yeah. It really doesn't. And sometimes the best research is generated when you've got people who fundamentally disagree with each other.
That should be refreshing as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Refreshing and a safe space.
Yeah, 100%. So yeah, I think that's probably how I'd answer those questions.
That's great. Thanks, Jo. Well, thank you for making the time today, and looking forward to more podcasts in the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Hannah.